August 31st, 1997, at 12:23 a.m., a black Mercedes races through a Paris tunnel, with paparazzi in pursuit, with a driver who had way too much to drink.
A laboratory result appeared on the screen, and the name attached to the sample was Princess Diana. Then the genetic profile was compared with an archived reference profile. It did not match. For a moment, the room had nothing to say. The sample had been presented as Diana's blood. It had been handled as evidence connected to one of the most scrutinized deaths of the modern age. Yet the genetic signature sitting in front of the investigators pointed somewhere else. That was the moment the question changed. It was no longer simply about what happened inside that Paris tunnel. It was about what happened to the evidence afterward. Because if the blood was not Diana's, then someone had made a mistake, someone had misunderstood the sample, or someone had deliberately allowed the wrong identity to follow that piece of evidence for years. And if that last possibility was even remotely true, the implications were enormous. Hi viewers, if you believe Diana deserved the truth, will you leave a comment saying "Truth for Diana" before watching the rest of this story? It takes only a second, but it shows that this question still matters. The disturbing part was that the alleged discovery did not instantly prove an assassination. It did not suddenly identify a hidden killer. It did not erase the official explanation of the crash. What it did was much more unsettling in a different way. It placed a question mark over something that was supposed to be simple. A blood-stained fragment had a history. It had a label. It had records. It had passed through hands. And somewhere along that journey, according to the account at the center of this story, the identity attached to the biological material began to conflict with what the DNA itself appeared to say. That distinction matters, because DNA does not care who a sample is supposed to belong to. It does not care whether the name written on a laboratory form belongs to a princess, a stranger, a witness, or a complete unknown. Genetic material carries its own signature. The label can say one thing, the biology can say another. And that is precisely where this story becomes difficult to ignore. For years, Diana's death has lived beneath a cloud of suspicion, grief, rumors, investigations, accusations, and competing explanations. Countless theories have attempted to answer the question of why she died. Some have pointed toward reckless driving, some toward the pursuit by photographers, some toward mechanical or human error. Others have gone much further, suggesting deliberate interference and hidden motives. But the alleged DNA discovery described in this investigation creates a different kind of problem. It does not begin with a theory. It begins with a piece of evidence. And evidence can be more dangerous than rumor because it can be tested. Imagine the scene.
We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident, and that her partner, Dodi Fayed, has also been killed. They were apparently being pursued by paparazzi on 2 motorcycles.
A fragment recovered from the aftermath of the crash sits inside the record of the investigation. Its history appears settled. Its identity appears settled. The biological material connected to it is treated as Diana's. Then years later, another examination begins. The old records are opened. Archived profiles are compared. The laboratory information is examined again, and suddenly, something does not fit. The profile attributed to Diana is not Diana's. That single discrepancy is enough to force an uncomfortable question into the open. How could biological material connected to Diana's death have been given an identity that the DNA itself did not support? There are innocent explanations. Contamination can happen. Evidence can be mislabeled. Records can contain clerical mistakes. Samples can become confused during complicated investigations. A person handling evidence can make an error without understanding the consequences. Any serious inquiry would have to consider those possibilities first. But then comes the detail that makes this account more troubling. The alleged problem was not simply that a modern test produced an unexpected result. The records themselves reportedly contained conflicting laboratory labels. That means the mystery was no longer confined to a machine reading a genetic profile. It moved onto paper. One record appeared to identify the material one way, another record raised a different question, and once investigators begin comparing dates, labels, storage information, and archived profiles, the evidence acquires something almost as important as the DNA itself: a timeline. Every piece of biological evidence has a journey. It begins somewhere. Someone finds it. Someone collects it. Someone identifies it. Someone records it. Someone transports it. Someone stores it. Someone tests it. And every transfer creates another opportunity for a mistake. That is why investigators care so intensely about what is known as the chain of custody. If the chain is intact, a sample can be traced backward. If it breaks, uncertainty enters. And uncertainty is precisely what the alleged Diana sample now raises. Because the question is not simply whether the DNA belonged to Diana. The question is whether the sample tested years later was unquestionably the same material that investigators originally recovered. That is a far more serious question, and it leads directly into the darkest possibility. What if the wrong sample was not merely tested? What if the wrong identity was attached to it long before anyone thought to question the label? There is a difference between discovering that evidence was contaminated and discovering that evidence was incorrectly identified. There is an even greater difference between an accidental mistake and deliberate deception. The available background for this story does not establish who made such a switch or whether a deliberate switch actually occurred. It does not provide a confirmed name of a culprit. It does not prove that anyone inside the palace, the police, or a laboratory intentionally altered evidence. But the alleged discrepancy creates the question. And questions have a way of becoming dangerous when the evidence refuses to cooperate with the official label. The most unsettling part may be what the DNA does not tell investigators. It does not automatically reveal who the blood belonged to. It does not automatically reveal when the material was collected. It does not automatically reveal whether the discrepancy happened at the crash scene, during transportation, inside a laboratory, or much later when records were being organized. And it certainly does not automatically prove that Diana's death was planned. That is exactly why the mystery becomes so compelling.
Yes, Dermot, the Press Association announced with a news flash at 4:41, that's just a few minutes ago, that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died, according to British sources.
There is no convenient answer waiting at the end of the first test. There is only a contradiction, a sample said to belong to Diana, a genetic profile that allegedly said otherwise, and a documentary trail that now demands another look. The investigators therefore had to go back, not to a conspiracy theory, not to palace gossip, not to decades of speculation, back to the evidence itself, back to Paris, back to the chaotic aftermath of the crash, back to the moment when biological material could have been collected, identified, packaged, transported, recorded, and eventually placed inside an official investigation. Because somewhere in that journey lies the answer to the first mystery. Was the sample wrong because someone made an ordinary mistake? Was it compromised through contamination? Or did someone deliberately change what investigators believed they were looking at? For those who have followed Diana's story for decades, that distinction is enormous. Because if the alleged DNA discrepancy is genuine, the issue is not simply another theory about a famous death. It is a question about the integrity of evidence, and that question cannot be answered by repeating what people have believed for years. It requires going back to the beginning. It requires following the evidence one step at a time. And the further the investigators reportedly followed that trail, the harder it became to ignore one disturbing possibility. The blood was not the only thing that needed to be identified. The history of the blood did too. And before anyone could ask who might have switched it, they first had to determine something even more basic. Where exactly had that sample been? From the moment it was recovered in Paris to the moment someone finally looked at its DNA and realized that the name attached to it might have been wrong. The first hours after the crash were not quiet. Paris moved around the wreckage in confusion, emergency crews rushing toward twisted metal while investigators faced the grim task of deciding what could still be recovered, identified, and preserved. In that chaos, every fragment mattered. A piece of glass could become evidence, a scrap of clothing could become evidence, a trace of blood could become evidence, and once something entered the investigative record, its identity could follow it for years. That is what makes the alleged blood sample so important. The danger with biological evidence is brutally simple. Once a sample is removed from a chaotic scene, its meaning depends on everything that happens next. Who collected it? Who handled it? What container held it? What number was written on the package? Where was it stored? Which laboratory received it? And most importantly, did the material tested later remain connected to the exact object originally recovered? Those questions may sound procedural. They are not. In a death as intensely examined as Diana's, a single disputed label can become a doorway into an entirely different investigation.
There was silence, and within hours, the news would reach every corner of the planet. Her name was Diana. But this isn't just a story about how she passed away, it's about how she lived and why, almost 30 years later, the world still can't let her go.
If the biological material connected to the fragment was genuinely hers, then the DNA could potentially help establish what happened to that evidence. If it was not hers, then investigators would have to explain how a different genetic profile became associated with her name. And that explanation could begin only with the night itself. The crash had created an environment almost impossible to control. Metal had folded inward, glass had shattered, personal belongings were scattered. People were moving through the scene. Emergency personnel were working under pressure, while police and investigators had to secure what they could. In such circumstances, evidence collection is not performed in a laboratory. It begins in noise, darkness, urgency, and confusion. That matters because later laboratory precision can never completely repair uncertainty created at the beginning. A perfect DNA test performed on the wrong sample is still the wrong answer. The alleged inquiry, therefore, turns attention away from the dramatic theories that have surrounded Diana's death and towards something much less glamorous: the evidence trail. A fragment is recovered, a biological stain is observed, the material is collected, a label is assigned. The item enters a record. From there, it becomes part of a chain. Every link should reinforce the one before it. The object recovered at the scene should be the object described in the documentation. The identifier on the evidence should correspond with the identifier in the laboratory. The biological material examined should be traceable back to the original collection. If one of those links breaks, the entire history becomes harder to trust. That does not automatically mean someone committed a crime. It can mean human error. It can mean contamination. It can mean poor documentation. It can mean two pieces of evidence were confused. But the longer an error survives without correction, the more difficult it becomes to determine where it began. And according to the background at the center of this story, that is where the old records allegedly became uncomfortable. Different laboratory labels reportedly did not tell exactly the same story. That detail matters more than it might appear. A laboratory label is not supposed to be a mystery. It exists to establish identity. It tells investigators which sample they are looking at and connects that sample to the evidence record. If two records identify the material differently, investigators have to stop and ask why. Was the discrepancy created when the evidence was first cataloged? Did someone make a transcription error? Was the sample transferred between facilities? Was another specimen involved? Or did the biological material itself become separated from its original identification? Each possibility points in a different direction, and that is why the investigation could not simply look at the DNA result and declare the case solved. The DNA was only one part of the puzzle. The paperwork was another. The physical fragment was another. The people who handled it were another. The dates were another. The storage history was another. Put them together, and investigators could potentially reconstruct the journey of the sample from the crash scene to the laboratory. That reconstruction is where the story becomes increasingly tense. Because the longer the trail becomes, the more opportunities there are for a mistake. And every opportunity creates another question. What was written first? What was changed later? Which label belonged to which specimen? Was the disputed blood identified immediately, or was its connection to Diana established afterward? Those questions are crucial because a DNA mismatch can have several explanations. If a sample is contaminated, the genetic profile can become complicated. If a sample is mislabeled, the DNA can be perfectly accurate while the identification is completely wrong. If a reference profile is incorrect, the comparison itself can become misleading. Only when the entire chain is examined can investigators determine which explanation deserves the most weight. This is also where the story must resist the temptation to jump straight to conspiracy. The claim that a sample was switched is explosive, but a claim is not the same thing as proof. The available background does not establish the identity of a person who allegedly switched anything. It does not establish that a deliberate substitution occurred, and it does not demonstrate that the crash itself was orchestrated. What it does establish within the story is a question worth investigating. Why would a sample repeatedly associated with Diana allegedly produce a DNA profile that did not belong to her? That question is powerful precisely because it does not need a conspiracy to become disturbing. Imagine spending years believing that one piece of evidence had a settled identity, only to discover that the biological material does not support that identity. The shock would not end with the laboratory report. It would immediately move backward. Who named it? Who recorded it? Who accepted it? Who tested it? Who reviewed the result? And who, if anyone, noticed the contradiction before the later inquiry? There is another reason the alleged discrepancy matters. Diana's death has attracted an enormous amount of public speculation. Every inconsistency has the potential to be absorbed into a much larger narrative. A small evidentiary problem can be presented as proof of something much bigger, even when the evidence does not support that conclusion. That makes careful examination even more important. The real mystery is not whether people can invent explanations. They have done that for decades. The real mystery is whether the evidence itself can withstand scrutiny. If the disputed sample truly was not Diana's, then the first question becomes almost unavoidable. Whose biological material was it? And that question leads to another. Why was it connected to Diana? The answer could be mundane. It could involve an innocent error made during a chaotic investigation. It could involve contamination or faulty documentation. It could even reveal nothing about the cause of the crash. But if investigators discovered evidence suggesting deliberate manipulation, the stakes would change completely. Because then the story would no longer be about a laboratory mistake. It would be about someone changing the evidentiary record. And that is where the old investigation begins to cast a longer shadow. If you believe a person's name should never be placed on evidence simply because the public expects that evidence to tell a certain story, then this is the moment to make your voice count. Like this investigation, share it with someone who still asks questions about Diana's death, and subscribe. Staying silent makes it easier for disputed evidence to disappear beneath decades of repetition. Questioning it keeps the record open. The trail now leads away from the laboratory and back toward the physical evidence itself. Because before investigators could ask whether anyone had manipulated a sample, they needed to know exactly what happened when that fragment first entered police hands. Who found it? Who touched it? Who documented it? And what did the original record actually say? Those details may sound small compared with the death of a princess, but sometimes history turns on something very small. A number written on a bag, a name written beside a sample, a line entered into a laboratory record. One overlooked detail can remain invisible for years, until somebody compares it with the evidence. And when that comparison produces a contradiction, the past suddenly becomes unfinished again. The crash had happened decades earlier. The questions had never completely disappeared. But now, according to the account behind this investigation, the blood itself was pointing investigators toward a problem nobody expected to find. The next step was to follow the evidence from the wreckage to the laboratory, one transfer at a time, because somewhere along that journey, the identity attached to the sample had allegedly changed, and if that change was deliberate, the person responsible would have needed one thing above all else: time. And time was exactly what this case had in abundance, because decades passed before anyone questioned the label. The laboratory record was supposed to settle the matter. Instead, it opened a second investigation. A disputed biological sample had already been given a name: Diana. That name appeared to follow the evidence through the investigative record. But when the alleged sample was compared with an archived DNA profile associated with the princess, the result reportedly refused to cooperate. The genetic profile did not match. Now the question became painfully precise. Not who killed Diana, not whether the crash was an accident, not which conspiracy theory deserved attention. The first question was much smaller and much harder to escape. What exactly was that sample? Because if the material tested was not Diana's, investigators needed to know whether the mistake happened in the laboratory, in the evidence room, during collection, during transportation, or somewhere else entirely. That is where chain of custody becomes critical. Biological evidence does not arrive at a laboratory with its history printed inside it. Investigators have to build that history through records. A sample receives an identification number. The number is connected to a location, an object, a date, and a person who collected it. The evidence is packaged, it is transferred, someone receives it, someone stores it, eventually someone opens it for examination. Each movement should leave a trace. If those traces agree, confidence grows. If they contradict one another, confidence begins to collapse. And according to the account behind this investigation, that is exactly what made the disputed Diana sample so troubling. The problem was reportedly not limited to the genetic result. Archived records were said to contain conflicting laboratory labels, creating uncertainty about how the material had been identified and tracked. That distinction changes everything. A DNA profile can be scientifically clear while the identity attached to it is wrong. The laboratory can accurately determine the genetic signature of a specimen and still be told that the specimen came from someone else. The machine can be correct. The label can be wrong. And if the label is wrong, investigators must follow the paper trail backward. The first possibility is simple human error. A chaotic crash scene can produce dozens of objects, fragments, personal belongings, and biological traces. Police and emergency workers are dealing with injuries, rescue operations, public pressure, and a rapidly changing environment. A mistake in cataloging could happen without anyone intending harm. The second possibility is contamination. Biological material can be transferred accidentally. A sample can be exposed to another source. Equipment can become compromised. Handling procedures can introduce uncertainty. These are ordinary problems in forensic work, and none of them requires a hidden plot. The third possibility is misidentification. Perhaps the material was collected correctly, but later associated with the wrong fragment. Perhaps two evidence identifiers became confused. Perhaps a label was copied incorrectly. Perhaps a record created later did not accurately reflect the original documentation. And then there is the possibility that investigators would have found hardest to dismiss: deliberate substitution. That possibility cannot simply be declared true because it is dramatic. It requires evidence of its own. Someone would have had to access the material, alter or replace it, preserve the appearance of continuity, and allow the wrong identity to survive across records. That is a much higher burden. But the alleged DNA discrepancy creates the reason to ask the question: if the sample did not belong to Diana, when did it stop being Diana's sample? Was it never hers? Was it mislabeled from the beginning? Or did something happen after collection? The answer depends on the chain. So investigators would need to reconstruct the journey of the disputed fragment, almost like a forensic timeline. First, the object had to exist at the crash scene. Then it had to be recognized as evidence. Then it had to be collected. Then it had to receive an identifier. Then it had to move through custody. Then the biological material had to be preserved. Then it had to reach a laboratory. Then the laboratory had to record what it received. Then a genetic profile had to be generated. Only after all of those steps could investigators compare the profile with an authenticated reference associated with Diana. And that comparison is where the alleged contradiction becomes powerful. If the genetic profile is different, there are two separate identities to consider. There is the identity of the biological material, and there is the identity written on the evidence record. Those two identities are supposed to be the same. If they are not, the investigation has a problem. The problem becomes even larger if multiple records repeatedly describe the material as belonging to Diana, because repetition can create an illusion of certainty. A statement appears in one report. The same identification appears in another document. A later summary repeats it. Eventually, everyone reading the file assumes the fact has already been established. But repetition does not turn an assumption into biological proof. A wrong label can become more convincing every time another person copies it. That is why the archived records matter. The alleged inquiry reportedly compared old DNA information with the documentation surrounding the disputed material. The purpose was not simply to produce another sensational result. It was to determine whether the biological profile and the evidence history could actually belong together. And if they could not, someone had to explain the gap. That explanation is where the story begins to move from science into accountability. A laboratory can say what genetic material it received. A record can say what the sample was called. But neither one, by itself, can explain why those two things might disagree. Someone had to connect them. That person may have made an innocent mistake. Another person may have copied the mistake. A later investigator may have assumed the earlier identification was correct. Or, if the more serious allegation were ever supported, someone may have intentionally created the mismatch between the biological material and its official identity. The evidence supplied for this story does not identify such a person. It does not provide a verified name. It does not establish a confirmed moment of substitution. It does not prove that palace officials ordered anything. Those gaps matter. They are not details that can responsibly be filled with imagination. But uncertainty does not erase the central question. It makes the question sharper. If the blood was not Diana's, why was it treated as Diana's? That question becomes especially uncomfortable because Diana's death already carries an enormous weight of public memory. Millions of people remember where they were when the news spread. Her image became inseparable from the circumstances surrounding the crash. Every new claim about evidence is therefore pulled into a much larger emotional story. That makes disciplined investigation essential. A disputed DNA result should not be used to manufacture certainty. It should be used to locate uncertainty. And the uncertainty here is concentrated in one place: the evidence trail. If the records showed unexplained gaps, conflicting identifiers, missing transfers, or unexplained changes, then the chain would demand deeper examination. This is where a small piece of paperwork can become more important than a dramatic theory. A date can matter. A signature can matter. A storage entry can matter. A laboratory accession number can matter. One inconsistency can force investigators to reopen an entire sequence of events. And that is exactly why the alleged conflicting labels cannot simply be brushed aside if they are genuine. The question is not whether every inconsistency proves wrongdoing. It does not. The question is whether the inconsistencies can be explained. If they can, the mystery may shrink. If they cannot, it grows. And while that investigation was unfolding, another pressure existed around the case. There were reportedly former palace officials who opposed reopening the evidence, warning that renewed scrutiny could reignite damaging conspiracy claims. That position can be understood without assuming guilt. Institutions often resist reopening painful historical controversies because every new examination can create headlines, public suspicion, legal complications, and renewed demands for answers. But opposition creates another question. If the official crash findings remain intact, why should examining one disputed biological sample threaten them? Perhaps because the public rarely separates one evidentiary problem from the entire case. Perhaps because any suggestion of mishandled evidence can become fuel for theories that have circulated for decades. Or perhaps because nobody wanted to discover that an old record was wrong. Whatever the reason, the resistance made the disputed evidence more significant, not less. And if this story has taught anything so far, it is that silence cannot determine whether evidence is trustworthy. If a piece of evidence was mislabeled, people deserve to know that it was mislabeled. If it was contaminated, that should be acknowledged. If the records were incomplete, that should be admitted. And if someone deliberately interfered with it, that would demand an entirely different level of accountability. So if you believe Diana's name should never be used to shield questionable evidence from scrutiny, make that position visible. Share this story. Subscribe, leave a comment. Doing nothing allows old labels to remain unquestioned simply because they have been repeated for years. Asking for the evidence to be examined is not the same as accepting a conspiracy. It is insisting that the record be honest. The investigators now faced the hardest part. They had a biological profile. They had an identity attached to it. They had records that reportedly did not align cleanly. But they still needed to know where the divergence began. That meant going deeper into the evidence history. Not just the final laboratory result, not just the label, not just the archived profile, every hand, every transfer, every record, every moment when the disputed fragment could have been separated from its identity. Because somewhere inside that sequence was the answer to a question that had waited for decades. Was the contradiction created by accident? Or did someone make sure the wrong name stayed attached to the blood? And if the latter possibility could ever be established, the next question would be even more disturbing. Who had access to the evidence long enough to change its story without leaving an obvious trace? The question was no longer whether the blood matched Diana. The question was whether someone had allowed a false identity to survive inside the evidence record for years. That distinction changed the atmosphere around the inquiry. A laboratory mismatch could be explained. A clerical error could be corrected. Contamination could be investigated. But if the same disputed material had repeatedly been presented as Diana's, despite a different genetic profile, the investigation had to examine something more uncomfortable than science. It had to examine intent. Intent is where forensic questions become human questions. A machine can produce a profile. A document can display a number. A storage record can show a transfer. None of those things can explain why a person made a particular decision. And that was the problem. If the alleged discrepancy began as an innocent mistake, somebody should have been able to reconstruct it. There should have been a point where the wrong label appeared, a transfer where confusion occurred, or a record that explained the error. If that explanation could not be found, suspicion naturally moved toward the gaps. The most important question was now brutally simple. Who had the opportunity to change the identity of the evidence? That did not mean investigators had identified a culprit. They had not. The material supplied for this story does not establish the name of anyone who switched the sample, nor does it prove that a deliberate substitution occurred. But the possibility could not be dismissed merely because it was uncomfortable. The evidence had to be followed, and following it meant examining the records that connected the physical fragment to the biological sample. A chain of custody is designed to prevent exactly this kind of uncertainty. Each transfer should leave a footprint. The person receiving the evidence number should remain consistent. The packaging should be documented. Storage should be recorded. Testing should be traceable. When all those pieces agree, the evidence becomes difficult to challenge. When they do not, the story becomes different. A disputed label can be harmless. A missing transfer can be significant. A repeated contradiction can become deeply troubling. According to the account behind this investigation, conflicting laboratory labels were among the details that forced renewed attention onto the sample's history. That did not automatically prove deception. It did something more basic. It made the old certainty impossible to take for granted. For years, the name attached to the evidence could have been enough to end the conversation. Diana, case closed. But DNA does not work that way. The biological profile either corresponds to the reference profile or it does not. And if the comparison was accurately performed, a mismatch demands an explanation. That is where the story begins to move toward the palace. The background supplied for this investigation says, former palace officials opposed reopening the evidence, warning that renewed scrutiny could revive damaging conspiracy claims surrounding Diana's death. That opposition, by itself, proves nothing. It could have come from a desire to prevent another wave of speculation. It could have reflected concern that an isolated evidentiary dispute would be transformed online into claims that the entire crash was fabricated. It could have been institutional caution after decades of public controversy. But opposition still creates a question. Why resist a closer examination if the examination cannot alter the established facts? There is an important distinction here. Re-examining a sample does not automatically mean reopening the entire case. A DNA test cannot, by itself, reconstruct every event inside the Paris tunnel. It cannot tell investigators what every driver was doing. It cannot determine every decision made in the minutes before the collision. And it cannot transform an unexplained discrepancy into proof of murder. That is precisely why the alleged finding is so unsettling. It stands apart from the larger conspiracy debate. If the official explanation of the crash remains supported by the broader evidence, then a disputed blood sample does not erase it. But if a piece of evidence was incorrectly identified, that problem remains regardless of whether the crash was accidental. This is where the investigation becomes a test of something larger than Diana's death. It becomes a test of whether historical evidence should be accepted simply because it has been repeated for decades. A label can become powerful through repetition. One investigator writes it. Another investigator copies it. A report summarizes it. A later researcher quotes the report. Eventually, the original assumption disappears beneath layers of repetition, leaving behind something that looks like established fact. But the underlying biological material does not change to satisfy the paperwork. That is why the alleged DNA result strikes at the foundation of the disputed evidence. The question is no longer, what does the label say? The question is, what does the sample say? And if those answers differ, the person reading the file has to choose whether to investigate the difference or ignore it. That is where public attention matters. When powerful institutions, famous families, or historic investigations are involved, people can become exhausted by controversy. They hear another claim and assume it is just another rumor. They move on. But that is precisely how unresolved questions can remain unresolved. So if the thought of Diana's evidence being dismissed simply because reopening it is inconvenient bothers you, do not scroll past this one. Like the video, share it, and subscribe. Not because every rumor deserves belief, but because evidence deserves examination. Silence gives old assumptions permission to become permanent. Asking for the evidence to be examined is not the same as accepting a conspiracy. It is insisting that the record be honest. The investigation now had two competing possibilities. One was ordinary. The sample had been mislabeled, contaminated, confused, or incorrectly documented. The other was extraordinary. Someone had deliberately altered the evidentiary trail. The problem was that both possibilities could produce the same result at first glance. A DNA profile that did not match Diana. Only the chain of custody could separate them. That meant investigators had to look for the moment when the evidence identity and the biological identity diverged. Was there a missing record? A changed identifier? An unexplained transfer? A laboratory entry that did not correspond with an earlier document? Or something more direct? If a deliberate switch had occurred, there should have been a point where the original material was replaced or its identity was changed. But a careful deception would not announce itself. It would hide inside ordinary paperwork. That is what made the alleged conflicting labels so important. A dramatic confession would be easy to understand. A secret entry in a file would be much harder to detect. And the longer the evidence remained untouched, the easier it would become for the disputed identity to harden into accepted history. There was another complication. Even if investigators established that the sample was not Diana's, they would still face the question of whose blood it actually was. That answer could potentially explain how the mistake happened. If it belonged to another person who had been present around the evidence, contamination might become more plausible. If it belonged to nobody who should have been connected to the fragment, the mystery would deepen. But without a confirmed identity, the DNA could only establish one thing with confidence. It did not belong to the person whose name had been attached to it. That alone was enough to reopen the question of how the sample entered the record. And now the investigation was approaching its most dangerous territory. Because once investigators begin asking who could have changed evidence, every person who touched it becomes part of the timeline. Not a suspect, not automatically, but a link. A link that could confirm the integrity of the chain, or expose where the chain broke. The alleged inquiry had begun with a blood-stained fragment. It had moved through laboratory profiles, archived records, conflicting labels, and questions about custody. Now it had reached the question nobody could answer with a simple test. Was this an old forensic mistake that survived because nobody thought to challenge it? Or was the mistake created intentionally? And if it was intentional, what reason could possibly justify placing someone else's blood under Diana's name? The DNA had not solved the mystery. It had done something more dangerous. It had narrowed the mystery to a single unanswered question. Who changed the story of the evidence? That question also changes how the final evidence must be judged. A mystery becomes credible only when every extraordinary claim is tested against the ordinary explanations first. If contamination explains the result, then contamination is the answer. If paperwork explains it, then paperwork is the answer. But if those explanations fail, and the records continue to point toward an unexplained intervention, the unanswered gap becomes harder to dismiss. For Diana, that gap carries weight. Her death left millions with questions. The possibility that even a piece of evidence was wrongly identified adds another layer of uncertainty to an event that has never escaped scrutiny. And there was one place left to look: the people, records, and decisions surrounding the evidence itself. The DNA had raised the question. Now it had to answer the only question that mattered: what did it actually prove? The answer was less comfortable than a conspiracy and more important than one. If the disputed sample truly did not belong to Diana, then one piece of evidence associated with her death had been incorrectly identified. That would be serious. It would demand an explanation. It would justify scrutiny of the records, the handling procedures, the laboratory history, and every point where the sample changed hands. But it would not, by itself, prove that Diana was murdered. That distinction is where this investigation must end. Because the temptation surrounding Diana's death has always been to take one unexplained detail and use it to explain everything. A strange document becomes proof of a secret operation. A contradiction becomes proof of a cover-up. A rumor becomes certainty because enough people repeat it. DNA does not work that way. DNA can identify biological material. It can establish whether two profiles correspond. It can expose a mismatch. But DNA cannot automatically tell investigators why that mismatch exists. It cannot say, "Someone switched me." It cannot identify a culprit without additional evidence. It cannot explain motive. And it cannot rewrite every other piece of evidence surrounding the Paris crash. That makes the alleged finding both narrower and more disturbing. The sample may not have been Diana's. If independently confirmed, that would mean the name attached to that evidence could not be accepted without question. The next issue would be the chain of custody. Where was the material collected? Who handled it? How was it labeled? Where was it stored? Who transferred it? Which laboratory received it? Did the identifier remain unchanged? Did the records describe the same object consistently? And at what point did the biological profile become connected to Diana? Those questions are not glamorous. They do not produce the instant certainty that conspiracy stories promise. But they are the questions that matter. If an innocent clerical mistake explains the discrepancy, then the mystery becomes smaller. If contamination explains it, the result must be interpreted differently. If the evidence was confused with another specimen, the records should reveal how. But if none of those explanations accounts for the discrepancy, the unanswered question becomes harder to ignore. Who changed the identity of the evidence? And that is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable boundary. The background provided for this investigation describes a confidential inquiry, archived DNA profiles, conflicting laboratory labels, and a disputed sample repeatedly presented as Diana's. It does not provide a verified name for a person responsible for switching the material. It does not provide independently established proof that a deliberate substitution occurred. Those missing pieces cannot honestly be invented. They matter, because accusing a specific person of manipulating evidence requires evidence of that person's involvement. Without it, the investigation has a mystery, not a solved crime. That distinction may disappoint anyone looking for a neat answer, but real investigations rarely end neatly. Sometimes the most important discovery is not a name. Sometimes it is the moment when an old certainty becomes impossible to defend without further examination. That is what the alleged DNA discrepancy represents. For decades, the public has been told different versions of Diana's death. Some accept the official account completely. Others believe there were hidden forces behind the crash. Between those positions sits a vast territory of uncertainty, filled with rumors, disputed claims, incomplete explanations, and questions that refuse to disappear. The disputed blood sample belongs inside that territory. it should not be treated as proof of a murder conspiracy. But neither should a genuine evidentiary contradiction be ignored simply because it threatens a comfortable narrative. And this is where the story becomes deeply human. Diana was not a theory, she was a person. Her death became a global wound, and the uncertainty surrounding it has lasted for decades. Every disputed piece of evidence carries emotional weight because people are not simply arguing about paperwork. They are trying to understand how someone so recognizable could disappear from the world in a single night. If the evidence connected to that night contains a mistake, people deserve to know. If the mistake was accidental, that deserves to be explained. If the records were incomplete, that deserves to be acknowledged. And if someone deliberately interfered with evidence, that would deserve an answer of an entirely different magnitude. So before accepting the next sensational claim about Diana, there is a better question to ask. Where is the evidence? Not the rumor, not the headline, not the anonymous allegation, the evidence. Because the most powerful revelation in this story is not that DNA has finally named Diana's killer. It has not. The alleged finding does something more subtle. It forces investigators to separate what the evidence actually says from what people have been told it says. That is a distinction that can change an entire investigation, and it brings the story back to the blood-stained fragment, a small piece of evidence connected to a catastrophic night. A label identifying it as Diana's, a genetic profile that allegedly says otherwise. Records that reportedly raise questions about the chain connecting those two identities. And decades of history standing between the original event and the people now asking whether the evidence was ever correctly identified. That is the chilling part. The blood did not suddenly appear decades later. The question did. And once that question exists, repeating the old answer does not make it disappear. If this investigation has made one thing clear, it is that Diana's name should not be used as a shortcut to certainty. Her death deserves more than sensational theories, but it also deserves more than unquestioned assumptions. If you believe that unresolved evidence should never be buried simply because reopening it is uncomfortable, this is your moment to take a stand. Leave a comment with what you think matters more, the official conclusion or the integrity of every piece of evidence supporting it. Share this story with someone who still remembers Diana and would want the question examined. And subscribe, because refusing to look away is sometimes the only way unanswered questions stay alive. But there is still one question hanging over everything. If the sample was not Diana's, whose blood was it? That question could eventually have an ordinary answer. It could expose contamination. It could reveal a clerical error. It could uncover a simple mistake made during the confusion surrounding the crash. Or, if further evidence ever demonstrated deliberate interference, it could point towards something far more serious. At present, the supplied account does not establish which explanation is correct. And that uncertainty is precisely why the evidence matters. The DNA did not deliver a convenient ending. It delivered a boundary. On one side is what can be established. On the other is what remains unknown. The official crash findings may remain unchanged. The rumors may continue. The theories may continue. But the disputed sample leaves one question that cannot be answered by repeating either side. Was the blood ever Diana's in the first place? Until that question is independently settled through verifiable evidence, the story remains unfinished. And perhaps that is the most haunting revelation of all. Sometimes history does not hide the truth in a secret room. Sometimes it hides it in a label, a name, a number, a record that everyone trusted. Until somebody finally looked at the blood and asked whether the name attached to it was true. Diana's death will always remain one of the most examined tragedies of the modern age. But examination only means something when people are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when the answer is ordinary, even when it is uncomfortable, and especially when the evidence raises a question nobody expected. The DNA, as described in this account, did not prove who killed Princess Diana. It did something more precise. It allegedly revealed that the evidence itself had a story that had never been completely settled. And until that story is independently verified, the final question remains exactly where it began. Not who was blamed, not who was rumored to be responsible, but who put Diana's name on that blood, and why. And if that answer ever emerges, it may tell us less about conspiracy than about how easily history can inherit an error.